When the waters gradually receded from the mountain tops, and the sun first shone upon the earth freshly cleansed by heaven's flood, we often imagine a new beginning, pure, untouched, unstained. Noah, the last righteous man of the old generation, stepped out of the wooden ark as if stepping out from an age of apocalypse. But have you ever wondered, after the door of the ark opened, what was the very first thing God did? Was it to bestow a blessing or to restart the order of mankind? The answer, if you read only Genesis, seems vague. But if you pause at the edges of orthodoxy and open the forgotten pages of the Book of Jubilees, you will find something that makes theology tremble in silence. Immediately after the flood, God did not merely save humanity, He re-established the covenant, not just with a promise, but with law, with sacrifice, with sacred regulations concerning blood, offerings, and time given directly to Noah. We have been taught that divine law began at Sinai, where Moses ascended the mountain alone to receive 2 stone tablets. But what if that was not the beginning, only a repetition? What if the first law was not written by a divine finger on stone, but had already been lived, preserved, and engraved into the memory of men like Noah, Shem, and Abraham for generations before? What if the law, like a rhythm of the cosmos, had always been present from the beginning, simply waiting for a faithful soul to be reborn after each upheaval? The Book of Jubilees does not embellish. It recounts, detail by detail, that the moment Noah stepped off the ark, he built an altar, selected clean animals, offered sacrifices on the correct day, and in that very act, the covenant was restored. Not with a nation, but with one man aware enough to preserve the sacred rhythm amid chaos. And from that man, a new flow began, not just a lineage of blood, but a lineage of law. Law did not follow life. It was the condition for life to continue. So if you have believed that the covenant began in the time of Moses, you may have only known half the truth. And if you've ever wondered why some people followed the law before there even was an Israel, perhaps it is time to return to a place few dare to look, the first patch of land after the flood, where Noah did not build a house, but built an altar, where no one heard the voice of the law, but one man lived by it, and that was the true beginning. There is a strange silence in Scripture that few notice. After the great flood ended, after Noah's ark came to rest, humanity stepped out from the shadow of destruction to begin a new chapter. But strangely, that chapter seems almost blank. Genesis mentions only a few lines: a sacrifice, a rainbow, a promise. Then the narrative swiftly moves on to future generations, as if that moment, amid the scent of receding floodwaters in the ashes of the old world, held nothing memorable. But there is one book, no longer part of the official Bible, that preserved that memory. The Book of Jubilees. A silent witness, cast to the margins of religious history, yet containing details so profound they demand theology to start afresh. Jubilees doesn't merely say Noah built an altar. It describes how he did it on the right day, at the appointed time, with clean animals already categorized, not by impulse but according to a system that had already existed. And when he offered the sacrifice, God did not simply receive the pleasing aroma. He reinstated the law. He gave Noah the first commandments for a post-apocalyptic world. Do not consume blood. Keep the holy festivals according to the sacred calendar. Distinguish between clean and unclean. From Noah, a new order began, but that you will not find in Genesis, not in Exodus, not in Leviticus, because the book that holds that memory was hidden away, not because it was wrong, but because it was too ancient, too different, too dangerous for a theological framework that could only imagine the law beginning at Sinai. And so Jubilees, the book handed to Moses atop that very mountain, was removed from the canon, as if when retelling history, humankind chose to omit what didn't fit. But memory is not easily erased. It only needs one person to remember, someone who is still listening. If you have ever felt that something is missing in the biblical account of Noah, your instinct may not be wrong, because the holiest thing was not the flood, but what happened after. And that ritual law, sacred calendar, and the blood covenant is preserved only in Jubilees. A book no longer read from the pulpit, yet still echoing as a whisper from ancient memory. A whisper waiting for you to hear it again. When the earth dried again, when the ark's door opened and the last family of mankind took their first steps on the cold, wet ground, we can imagine the gentle chaos in their minds. How do we begin again? They may have been frightened, exhausted, hungry. They might have thought of rebuilding shelter, finding water, making fire, laying the foundation for a village. But Noah did not do that. According to the Book of Jubilees, his first act was not to build for himself, but to re-establish the broken link between heaven and earth. He built an altar, offered a sacrifice on the correct day, according to the correct rites, with clean animals already chosen beforehand, not in haste, not out of fear, but because he knew, without the covenant, everything would merely be a form of living, without a soul. There was no thunder, no pillar of fire from the sky. But in that very quiet act, Noah reconnected a divine pulse that had been severed since the days of Adam, a spiritual bloodstream that ceased to flow when the watchers fell, when Nephilim filled the earth, when the world descended into chaos, not just moral, but ritual. And then, in a solitary moment, in the sacred void after the flood, Noah, through one timely ceremony, restored order. According to Jubilees, what Noah did was not mere symbolism. It was the restoration of the covenant. A covenant not written in text, but lived out in action. When he chose the right offering, on the right day, in the right way, he was reviving a law once passed down from the time of Abel. A sacred memory mankind had thought lost. And the most profound truth is, God responded, not with a voice, but with the giving of law. From that sacrifice, once again, humanity was entrusted with commandments about blood, about rights, about time. No nation, no tablets of stone, just one man and one sacred rhythm. In today's world, we are accustomed to sermons about commandments, tablets, and decrees. But sometimes it is the quiet acts, a timely offering, a prayer made in season, a life lived in the rhythm of sacred time, where the covenant is truly restored. Noah did not start a religion. He simply restored a rhythm, and from that rhythm, the entire history of the soul began anew. Perhaps the first thing we must do is not something grand, but simply to live again on the right day, in the right way, in the right rhythm, just as Noah once did. After the scent of Noah's offering rose and mingled with the clean air of a world just washed, God did not respond with silence. He answered, not with a tempest, nor with an empty blessing, but by re-establishing order. He began to give law, but not foreign commands. These were laws that touched the very structure of life, blood and time. And do not eat blood, a law that seems simple but is foundational to the reverence for life. For in the blood is life, and life does not belong to man for casual consumption. That law was not merely moral, it was the reassertion of a sacred boundary between humanity and the divine within creation. Then God commanded Noah to observe the appointed festivals, but not according to any human-devised calendar. It was a cycle already established, 364 days divided into complete weeks, with nothing lacking and nothing in excess. According to the Book of Jubilees, this was the calendar used by the angels, given from the time of creation, and the only one aligned with the rhythm of heaven. Only by observing the festivals according to this cycle could mankind truly live within the covenant, not because of ritualism, but because they were living in harmony with the frequency of God. And from that, a new pattern was unveiled. Life after the flood was not merely about survival, but about living within the law. A law not born from courtrooms or royal decrees, but from worship, from blood poured in proper measure, from days kept at the appointed time. Every human act, from eating to resting, from sacrificing to working, was meant to align with this rhythm. It was the only way to prevent falling into chaos once more. From this rhythm, division began, because not everyone could keep the sacred calendar. According to Jubilees, only those who retained the memory of the holy calendar understood the right timing for action. Those who forgot, even if they had faith, offerings, and morality, began to fall out of sync. From falling out of sync came deviation in worship. From deviation in worship came deviation in the soul. The laws of blood and sacred time after the flood were not burdensome religious obligations, but the very rope holding humanity back from the abyss they had once fallen into before the flood. A new world could only be preserved if its people still remembered how to live in rhythm. Noah's action did not end at the altar. From that offering, he received not only blessing, but responsibility. The responsibility to preserve the sacred memory of time, of life, and of divine order. And through him, a law not written in stone, but inscribed in the days and months, was passed down to those still quiet enough to listen. After Noah's altar was built, after the promise was given, and the law of blood established, humanity appeared ready to step into a new age of peace. But that was only the surface of a deeper division. According to Jubilees, from Noah's 3 sons began a silent spiritual tension, not over land, power, or pride, but over memory. Specifically, who would preserve the sacred memory of covenantal law, and who would lose it? Jubilees tells us that Shem, the eldest son, was the one to whom Noah entrusted the sacred calendar, the laws of sacrifice, and the rhythm of the covenant life. Not because he was the firstborn by birth, but because he was faithful. He not only remembered the holy days, he lived by their cycle. He taught them to his children and grandchildren, establishing a lineage not swept away by the worldly calendar or corrupted ritual. From Shem, a thread of memory was maintained, passing through Eber to Abraham and then to Israel. Those who kept the law were not simply rule followers. They were the ones who lived within an unbroken sacred memory, stretching back to the time after the flood. In contrast was Ham, In a story both controversial and full of spiritual depth, Ham was cursed, not merely for an act of dishonor, but for a broken rhythm. According to Jubilees, his descendants soon abandoned the law of blood, ceased to keep the Sabbath, and no longer discerned between what was clean and unclean. The line of Ham not only expanded territorially toward the south, but also drifted spiritually from the covenant. And this was not merely a loss of belief, but of sacred identity. Thus, the divide began, not between nations, but between those who still remembered and those who forgot. One group walked according to the rhythm of heaven, the other was swept into the calendars of men. One offered sacrifices at the proper times, kept clean blood. The other lived in the chaotic cycles of desire, war, and dominion. And this rift, you will see, stretch unbroken to the time of Abraham, to Moses, until the people no longer even remembered what the Sabbath was. The issue is not simply who is right and who is wrong, it is who remembers and who has forgotten. Sacred memory does not survive by chance, it is preserved through individuals, through families, through the cycle of sacred time. And each time a generation loses it, the covenant slips further into silence. But Shem, his line, preserved the rhythm. And from that rhythm, the covenant continued to spread. Even if broken, hidden, it was never extinguished. Perhaps the question is not, what do you believe, but rather, what do you still remember? Because in the post-flood flow of time, it is memory. That is the true sacred inheritance. Before there was a nation of Israel, before there were temples, priests, or stone tablets etched with commandments, there were people who lived by a sacred rhythm, not because they were forced, but because within them still echoed a memory not merely told in words, but lived in cycles, repeating faithfully through seasons, days, and appointed times. According to the Book of Jubilees, when the flood ended and Noah built the first altar, he not only offered a sacrifice, he received a gift, a calendar of 364 days, a complete structure of time without deviation or surplus. A calendar not born of kingly decree, not based on observation of seasons, but given from heaven. That calendar was the heartbeat of the covenant. This changes the way we understand law, for if the law was transmitted after the flood, through an established cycle, then men like Noah, Shem, and Abraham did not wait for Moses to know what was the right day, the appointed time. They lived within a rhythm that heaven and earth both sang. They did not ask, "When must we offer sacrifice?" They knew, because they still had memory and lived within the calendar. No tablets needed, no priests required, only remembrance. And that memory, sealed by time, became the sacred foundation for maintaining order in all humanity after the flood. Jubilees does not describe a religion, it describes a cycle. Each week of 7 days ending in Sabbath, each year divided by appointed times, each generation following a path set since the beginning of creation. And Noah, the one who survived the end of the old world, was the one reconnected to that rhythm, not to rule over others, but to safeguard the order of the human soul from falling into chaos once again. And that is the crucial point. Before any religious institution existed, law was already present, but hidden in memory and in the cycle of time. If today you look at a printed calendar and see holidays marked, pause. Ask yourself, where did they come from? And do they still follow heaven's rhythm as they once did? You may be living by the calendar of the world while forgetting the calendar of the covenant. And if you've ever felt something was off, perhaps your soul still remembers a different rhythm, the rhythm of heaven, the rhythm of those, like Noah, who lived not from obligation, but from memory. When we hear the word covenant, we often think of a promise, a sacred agreement between God and humanity, marked by words, symbols, and divine seals like the rainbow or the stone tablets. But the Book of Jubilees reveals something deeper. The covenant is not merely a promise, it is a structure of life, a divine system operating through time, through cycles, through sacred distinctions and appointed rhythms. It is not merely agreement, it is a way of life set in motion from the beginning of creation. And Noah, after the flood, was not simply the one to ritually renew that promise, but the one who stepped back into a system that had always existed and was now being fully restored. According to Jubilees, the covenant included not only commandments, but also a sacred calendar, 364 days divided into appointed times, each week with a Sabbath, each month with sacrificial markers, each season bearing spiritual meaning. There were prohibitions, like abstaining from blood. There were things to remember, like distinguishing what is clean. There were rhythms that could not be broken, like the Sabbath. These were not religious laws, but the expressions of a harmonious system where humanity aligned with the heavenly bodies, with the order of creation. To live within the covenant meant to live in rhythm. To fall out of rhythm was to lose the covenant, even if the promise still lingered on the lips. That is why the patriarchs, from Noah to Shem, from Eber to Abraham, lived according to an unchanging order of time. They did not merely believe, they lived the rhythm. And from that, the covenant was preserved not by power, but by the faithful memory of those who kept the law. It was a silent loyalty, stronger than any proclamation. They did not ask daily whether it was a holy day. They knew, because they lived in a system where every breath resonated with the cycle of the covenant. And when later nations lost the sacred calendar, when they shattered the divine rhythm of time, what they lost was not just tradition, but the very foundation of the covenant. A system fractured from within. A chaos not born of malice, but of misalignment. Jubilees warns, sin does not always begin with evil intent, but often from living out of sync, out of season, out of rhythm. The covenant does not demand perfection. It asks only this: live in rhythm. If you've ever felt your life was in disarray, even with faith, prayers, and good intentions, it may be because you've drifted from the rhythm of the covenant. And the way back is not to find a new doctrine, but to pause, to listen, and to step once more into sacred time. The covenant is not broken by a single act, but by prolonged forgetting. And to restore it, sometimes, all you need is to remember the right day, before Moses, before Israel walked into the wilderness, before the stone tablets bearing the 10 Commandments were given atop Sinai. There was a man who lived his entire life according to divine law, not because he was forced to obey it, but because flowing through his veins was a rhythm passed down from those who preserved the covenant through memory. That man was Abraham, not a priest, not a lawgiver, just a man who knew how to listen, how to remember, and how to keep what had been entrusted to him from the forefathers. According to the Book of Jubilees, Abraham did not invent his righteous way of life. He inherited the law from the line of Shem, the line to whom Noah had passed down the sacred calendar, the festival days, the laws of blood, and the correct ways of offering. Abraham knew when the Sabbath was. He knew which animals were clean to sacrifice. He knew when to cease from labor and when to offer family sacrifices. These things were not written in the law, but they were alive in the way he lived. And that quiet faithfulness was proof that the covenant had always existed, not on stone, but in blood and memory. Abraham didn't need his nation to be formed to live in rhythm. He already lived in a sacred cycle, a frequency preserved by Shem, passed down like a soul song only the quiet ones could hear. This causes us to rethink. Perhaps the law does not begin when it is declared, but already exists in a stream of memory. And if Abraham, the father of many nations, lived by divine law before Israel ever existed, then the covenant may transcend all racial borders, all religious structures, and belong to those still faithful to the original rhythm. What made Abraham a friend of God was not that he was the first to believe, but that he dared to live according to a rhythm nearly forgotten, a rhythm of sacrifice, of holiness, of sacred distinction, not out of legal obligation, but because he knew to live on the right day, in the right way, is to walk within the covenant. From Shem to Abraham was not a line of great numbers or worldly power, but of endurance. They did not argue about doctrine, they lived it. They did not wait for a temple, they built altars in the midst of life. And the mystery is this: though hidden from the official books of law, Jubilees recorded it. A testimony that the covenant is not confined to any one nation, but belongs to anyone who still lives in heaven's rhythm. The question is not what bloodline you come from, but what rhythm you still live by. For in an age of constant change, there remains one rhythm that never shifts. And perhaps, like Abraham, you are being called to step back into it. Have you ever paused in the middle of an ordinary day and asked yourself, is there anything sacred about today? Is there something worth remembering, or is it all blurring together? When humanity no longer knows which days are holy, when the lunar cycle is just an agricultural schedule, when life is no longer tied to heaven's rhythm, the soul falls into a nameless, grey void. According to the Book of Jubilees, that forgetting is the true root of chaos. Sin does not begin with evil, it begins with being out of rhythm. When the soul no longer discerns what is holy and what is ordinary, when time flattens, loses its pulse, then the heart slowly fades the line between light and darkness. The divine law in Jubilees is not merely a list of regulations. It is a system of distinctions, where time itself is sanctified. Each appointed feast is a marker for humanity to pause, to remember, to recalibrate both steps and soul. But when those markers are ignored, when the Sabbath is deemed inconvenient, when the holy days are altered by political calendars, the human soul loses its anchor. It no longer knows when to rest. It no longer knows when to offer. It no longer distinguishes what is clean from what belongs to the covenant. Everything becomes relative, and in a world of relativity, chaos reigns. Jubilees warns, sin does not begin when one murders, betrays, or worships false gods. It begins long before that moment you skip a festival, when you work on a day meant for rest, when you eat without discernment, when you no longer remember which day is holy. For law is not meant to control, but to remind you how to live in rhythm. Without law, there is no rhythm. Without rhythm, there is no order. And without order, the covenant, though still preached, becomes only an echo no one hears. That is why Jubilees returns to the beginning, Noah. When he stepped out of the ark, he did not only see a new world, he heard an ancient rhythm, and he chose to live within it once more. He built an altar, offered a sacrifice at the appointed time, received the sacred calendar from heaven. In a world freshly recreated, Noah became the keeper of the soul's structure for humanity. And from him, Shem continued. From Shem, Abraham walked forward. Each one, not heroes, but men who lived within the law. If today your heart feels disoriented, uncertain, ask yourself, by what calendar are you living? In what rhythm? Perhaps what you lack is not more instruction, but a sacred calendar given from heaven. Perhaps you don't need to find a new faith, but simply to live again by an ancient cycle, a cycle your soul once knew and is now trying to remember. When the waters withdrew and the ark came to rest, there were no angelic trumpets, no thunder like on Mount Sinai, only earth still wet with humanity's tears, and one man, Noah, stepping down in silence. He did not establish a nation, did not build a palace, did not search for food. The first thing he did, according to Jubilees, was build an altar. He chose clean animals, according to standards handed down from the forefathers. He waited for the appointed day, at the appointed time, and offered a sacred sacrifice. No one demanded it, no one witnessed it, but heaven knew, and God received it. That was the moment the covenant was renewed, not with words, but with action, not with law on stone, but with a life lived in sacred timing. This should shake us. For we have long assumed that the law began at Sinai, with Moses and the tablets of stone. But if the covenant was re-established immediately after the flood, then it means the law did not originate from a single moment of revelation, but from a continuous stream of sacred memory. Noah did not invent rituals. He did not devise the laws of blood. He did not declare his own day of rest. All had already been given, and he merely stepped back into the rhythm in a world just made new. The survival of life after the flood is the part the traditional books often emphasize, but Jubilees reveals something deeper. What was preserved was not only the body, but the memory of the covenant. And Noah re-established it, not by preaching, but by acting at the right time. That silent sacrifice marked a new beginning for divine law. It occurred long before Sinai, and it needed no nation to witness it, only one man who remembered. From Noah's action, a cycle reopened. The sacred calendar was restored. The law of blood was reiterated, and the line of Shem was given the task of guarding the covenant for generations yet unknown. Therefore, if we wish to understand the true origin of the law, we must return not only to Moses but to Noah. We must go back before Sinai, to the moment when a man stepped onto newly formed ground, and while the world still trembled with newness, he chose to lay the first stone, not for a city, but to rebuild a covenant between heaven and earth. No words required, only one act at the appointed time. And that was the true beginning. Not all distortion begins with a wrong decision. Sometimes it begins with a day moved, a festival forgotten, a sacred rhythm broken. According to Jubilees, God gave humanity a calendar, not governed by the moon nor by agricultural convenience, but a 364-day calendar, evenly divided, precise, bearing the rhythm of heaven. Each season had its sacred time, each week its Sabbath, each cycle a holy pulse between man and heaven. That calendar was not for counting, it was for keeping the covenant alive in each day. But in time, later generations altered it. They added days, removed months, followed lunar cycles, royal decrees, political needs. The festivals no longer aligned with the appointed cycles. The Sabbath shifted. The offerings no longer occurred in their due seasons. And when the markers were erased, people began to lose direction. No one set out to rebel against the covenant, but they fell out of sync. They kept laws, but at the wrong times. They offered sacrifices, but out of season. And so the covenant cracked, not from lack of belief, but from dissonance with sacred frequency. Jubilees warns, when time rebels, the soul loses its way. You may still believe in God, still pray, still do good, but if you live out of rhythm, your spiritual life slowly veers off course. Not because you don't love God, but because you no longer know which day is holy. When time is no longer divided, sanctification loses its anchor. Thus, what once was the inner compass of the patriarchs, a calendar of heaven, was replaced by agricultural calendars, royal timetables, administrative schedules. The covenant, meant to be a way of living in rhythm, was reduced to a fixed doctrine. When did we stop looking to the skies to measure time and start relying on printed pages? If you've ever felt that your faith remains, but your spirit drifts into emptiness, examine your rhythm. Perhaps you love God, but live by the wrong calendar. Perhaps you keep commandments, but in the wrong season. And that, according to Jubilees, is enough for the covenant to cease resonating in your soul. Because the failure is not always in the heart, but sometimes in the rhythm. Not every lineage after the flood returned to the law. Not everyone who stepped off the ark retained the sacred rhythm. Some expanded borders, built fortresses, founded kingdoms, but lost the memory of God. But amid the chaos of a reborn world, there was one man who walked quietly, not for power, not for fame, but for a sacred duty, to preserve the covenant. That man was Shem. According to Jubilees, Shem was not merely Noah's son. He was the one who kept all the laws, the sacred calendar, and the correct forms of sacrifice handed down after the flood. He created nothing new. He preserved what was given. While the line of Ham journeyed south, building civilizations and establishing rule through force and cities, Shem kept the invisible things, sacred times, holy days, blood laws, clean offerings. He was not prominent among the nations, but he was the only one who still knew when Sabbath fell, when the first fruits should be offered, when a soul needed purification through ritual. And because he kept that rhythm, the line of the covenant remained unbroken through him. Eber, Shem's descendant, continued to guard that memory. From Eber came a people called Hebrew, not by race, but because they retained the ancient rituals. And from that line emerged a man named Abraham, a man we often highlight for his faith, but we sometimes forget that he had been taught to keep the festivals, to distinguish the clean, to offer sacrifices at the correct time. All of these things did not come from Sinai, but from Shem, from one quiet, faithful man living in a world drifting far from the covenant. Jubilees does not describe Shem with grandeur, but that silence resounds powerfully. For in every age, someone must dare to remember when the world seeks to forget. Sacred law, if not passed through living souls, becomes nothing but dead script. But because of Shem, it became a living stream, carried from one generation to another, not through books, but through timely action, faithful observance, and wordless loyalty. We owe much to men like Shem, not because they left temples, but because they preserved sacred rhythm, not because they stood out, but because they did not let the holy slip away. In today's world, you too may be called to be a Shem, a quiet soul, preserving what the world has forgotten, the rhythm of the covenant. No need for loud proclamations, only right timing. Because sometimes keeping just one festival means preserving an entire legacy from being lost. After the waters withdrew, not every bloodline returned to the law. The ark carried only one family, but from that family arose opposing paths. According to Jubilees and other ancient texts, some lineages, especially those from Ham and Canaan, did not preserve the sacred memory like Shem. They drifted from the ritual law, lived by their own rhythms, and created religious systems and timekeeping that broke from the original cycle. And from this, the spiritual tension between bloodlines began, not merely cultural differences, but a conflict between heaven's rhythm and man's rhythm. Jubilees implies that traces remained from the era of the Watchers, from the chaos before the flood. Though the bodies of the Nephilim were washed away, the spirit of rebellion, forbidden knowledge and broken rhythm passed on through the lines that rejected the law. They built cities, founded nations, created their own calendars, separating themselves from the 364-day cycle given from heaven. And then every people had a different day of rest, a different festival, a different definition of what was clean. The divine order was fractured into hundreds of smaller orders. The covenant was fragmented. No one knew the true rhythm anymore, and everyone believed themselves to be right. From this tension, conflicts arose, not just wars over land, but theological battles. One nation called their holy day the season of sowing. Another celebrated the moon. Some still offered sacrifices, others moved towards self-offering. Some kept the Sabbath, others forgot it ever existed. This did not merely confuse the mind, it disoriented the soul. For when you no longer know what day is holy, you no longer know when it is time to return. And the most troubling part, this tension has never ended. Even today, the world spins on countless different calendars. We measure time by office hours, fiscal quarters, and commercial breaks. But where is the true Sabbath? Where is the heavenly festival cycle? How many still live by the original rhythm, and how many are drifting away from the time of the covenant? That question is not to assign blame, but to awaken. For the spiritual conflict has never been just between nations. It is a question between bloodlines and between souls. Are you living by Shem's rhythm, or by a memory already broken since ancient times? Because if law no longer lives within a cycle, then everything becomes empty form. And from hollow form, conflict is inevitable. We were raised with the image of Moses on Mount Sinai, holding 2 stone tablets, as though that was the first time humanity heard God's law. But what if that moment was not the beginning, but a reminder? What if the words etched in stone that day had already echoed before, through Noah? when the earth was still damp with floodwaters and the first post-flood altar was still smoking. According to the Book of Jubilees, when Moses climbed the mountain, he did not enter a completely new revelation. He was receiving again, being reminded of what had already been given long ago. The laws about blood, the Sabbath, the offerings, the distinctions of what is clean were already established for Noah, already preserved by Shem, already lived out by Abraham. Sinai, then, was not the starting point, but a moment of restoration, a milestone in a long journey where the covenant, once forgotten, was brought to light again. This does not diminish Moses, but illuminates the entire transmission. For if the law was given again, it means God had never abandoned it. He patiently repeated it, like a conductor trying to bring back an old melody to an orchestra that had fallen out of tune. And if you begin at Sinai, you are hearing a symphony midway. You must go back to the first movement, where Noah built an altar, where blood was sanctified, where the first cycles began to count again. This revelation shakes the foundations of modern theology. For if the law is not just the expression of a new covenant, but a reminder of an ancient one, then we cannot only look forward, we must also look back. And if you long to live in the covenant, you must learn to live again like a new Noah, pausing amid the chaos, looking again at the old rhythm, and walking in the sacred cycles once established after the flood. Moses was not the originator. He was the one who called it back to mind. And if you listen to his words without remembering the memory he was invoking, you only understand half. The covenant is not a brand new contract. It is the echo of an ancient commitment. A commitment that was once written, not on stone, but in the actions of a solitary man who offered at the appointed time, who kept the law in its proper season, and who lived according to heaven's calendar in the midst of a world freshly cleansed. His name was Noah. And if you still desire to keep the covenant, you must remember from there. When we speak of the law of God, the first image that often comes to mind is Mount Sinai, where thunder rolled, and 2 stone tablets bearing the 10 Commandments were handed to Moses. But what if that wasn't the beginning? What if those inscriptions were merely a confirmation, a reiteration of what had already been given long before, just after the waters receded, just as human feet touched the earth again, now washed clean? According to the Book of Jubilees, when Moses ascended the mountain, he was not handed a new set of laws. On the contrary, he was shown the full sacred memory that had long been forgotten, the memory of a covenant established with the patriarchs, beginning with Noah, preserved by Shem, and fully lived out by Abraham. Sinai was not the first time God spoke. It was the moment he repeated the call that had once echoed after the great flood, when Noah built an altar and offered a sacrifice on the appointed day. This reverses our entire traditional understanding. We once thought that before Sinai there was no law, only grace. But Jubilees reveals the law was once lived, not out of fear, but out of faithfulness. Not because of compulsion, but because it was the rhythm of the sacred. Noah did not wait for a command. He kept the appointed time. Abraham did not need tablets. He lived the rituals in their seasons, which means the law is not an imposition, but the restoration of an order that existed from the beginning. Sinai, then, becomes a point of reconnection, a place where God recalls a forgotten melody, calling his people back into a rhythm once lost. And you, if you begin only at Moses, you are stepping into a symphony whose overture has been forgotten. If you want to live fully in the covenant, you must begin after the flood. You must remember Noah. You must relearn how to build the first altar, how to observe the holy seasons, how to live by the rhythm of blood, of days, of the sacred. As though you were the first to step off the ark, standing in a reborn world and choosing again what will be the center of your life. This is not merely a concept, it is an invitation not just to believe, but to remember. Not merely to keep the law, but to preserve the memory of where that law was born, not on stone, but in the complete act of a man who chose to live in rhythm amid chaos. His name was Noah. And if you're still listening, you could be the next. Not all sacred things are lost when forgotten by man. Some, like underground rivers, continue to flow, still singing beneath the surface, waiting for someone still enough to hear them. The covenant is like that. Though generations have forgotten the festivals, neglected the laws of blood, blurred the Sabbath, and erased the lines between the clean and the defiled, the covenant has not vanished. It does not live in a scroll. It exists as a sacred rhythm, quietly waiting to be stirred again. The Book of Jubilees is not merely an ancient text. It is a bell that awakens the memory long asleep within humanity. It's not an addition to the Bible, but the echo of what once was the center. An echo from Noah's altar, from Shem's discernment, from a promise carried through blood, all the way to Abraham and to those who still live in rhythm. It reminds us that what once was is still there. We have only stopped living in season. We've forgotten who we are, but that can change. Not through major reforms, not through edicts from above, but through the awakening of a single soul. If one person, just one, stops to keep a true Sabbath, to separate the clean from the chaos, to act at the appointed time as Noah once did, the covenant begins to come alive again. It does not need to be rewritten, it only needs to be relived. You don't need to be a prophet, you don't need to be a priest. You only need to be one who hears something forgotten. And if among all you've read or heard, something struck your heart, a vague sense that this is right, then you are still within the circle of the covenant. Because the covenant has not been destroyed, only forgotten. And all it takes is one soul remembering, for the altar's flame to reignite, not with wood, but with will. Not with public rituals, but with a quiet, right rhythm of life. And once that rhythm awakens in you, you are no longer outside the story. You have become the keeper of the flame. Noah is not a mythic hero or a distant figure trapped in old scrolls. He was a man who lived amid chaos, a flesh and blood human like us, but chose to do what no one else would: stop. While the world spun into madness, while people chased instinct, while angels fell and the earth was stained with blood and broken rhythm, he didn't run. He stood still, and in that stillness he heard a different rhythm, not of the world, but the sacred beat left behind by the patriarchs. He kept the festivals, not because he was commanded, but because his soul still remembered. He distinguished clean animals, not out of strict law, but because the sacred memory was still alive within him. He didn't build towers, he didn't seize land, he built an altar, not to glorify himself, but to reconnect with the Creator, the one who had once set a sacred rhythm in the breath of mankind. If today you, amid a world spinning with earthly calendars, deadlines and commercialized holidays, choose to pause for just one day, Keep one Sabbath hour. Discern what is pure for your soul. Preserve one act in its season, one prayer in its moment, one silence in its rightful place. Then you are doing what Noah did. You are building your altar, not with wood, not with stone, but with your choice to live in right rhythm within the noise. You don't need an ark. You don't need a voice from heaven. You only need one moment when you stop, when the world urges you forward. One moment when you preserve a distinction others call outdated. One moment when you live as though another calendar is at work, the calendar of the covenant. Then at that moment, you are not an outsider. You are the one rebuilding the first altar after the flood. And if enough people begin to live that way, the covenant will no longer be a memory. It will be reality, not in temples, but in every heart that knows when to pause, how to live in season, and how to love in rhythm amid a world that has lost its beat. Every soul can be a Noah. It could be you, if you are listening. No one can say humanity was not warned. No one can say we were never given the law. After the flood, when everything seemed to return to zero, God did not leave humanity stumbling in the dark. He gave the covenant again. He restored the law. He used Noah, the survivor, as a bridge between two worlds, the world before the flood and the world after the waters withdrew. And Shem, the son who remembered, continued it. He preserved the sacred calendar, the laws of purity, the correct form of sacrifice. But not everyone kept it. Ham, one of the three survivors, lost the sacred frequency, not because of some great sin, but because he broke connection with the rhythm God had just restored. And that was enough for the curse to fall on Canaan, a lineage that no longer kept the seasons, no longer distinguished sacred from profane. From there, disorder began, not through war, but through misalignment, not by bloodshed, but by forgetfulness. The tragedy lay not in rebellion, but in indifference. Slowly, the nations parted from the sacred calendar. They no longer knew which days were holy, which festivals were divine. They blurred clean and unclean. They forgot the line between sacred and ordinary. And the world, which seemed to be evolving, began returning to chaos. No more ark to save, no more Noah to keep rhythm. The tragedy of humanity did not begin with a lack of instruction. It began with having been taught, but not living it. With once having heard, but no longer remembering. With once having law, but falling out of rhythm. And that forgetfulness is not just a thing of the past. It continues even now, in every soul that no longer knows which day is holy, in every community that has forgotten what the covenant even means. The question is not, was the law ever given to us? The question is, why did we stop keeping it? And each time a generation loses that memory, chaos returns, not by judgment from heaven, but by disorder springing from hearts that have fallen out of sacred time. It's not that the law was taken away, we walked away from it. And that is where the real tragedy begins. You may have heard many sermons, read dozens of scripture chapters, watched hours of content about fallen angels, Nephilim, and divine law. But in the midst of all those waves of knowledge and images, have you ever paused, not to learn something new, but to listen to the rhythm within your own soul? Have you ever asked, what rhythm am I living in? The rhythm of the market, of the work week, of modern life? Or is there another rhythm, deeper, quieter, that your soul once knew but forgot? The Book of Jubilees is not meant to convince, but to remind. It does not call you to change your religion or your rituals, but simply to bring you gently back to an ancient memory, that there was once a way of life established from the beginning, from Adam to Noah, from Shem to Abraham, a rhythm of living that never demanded perfection, only that you live in season, in time, in sincerity. If the divine law is the rhythm of the cosmos, then when you live out of sync, everything around you begins to fall out of order. But the good news is that light has never gone out. It's not blazing like the lightning of Sinai, not brilliant like the appearance of angels. It is more like a single ember in ashes, waiting for a soul quiet enough to breathe it into flame, not to burn, but to warm memory. If, as you've heard these words, there was even a moment where your heart grew still, where a single sentence made you want to pause and breathe, then perhaps that light just touched you. And that is not the end of the message. That is the beginning of the covenant, not in a book, not on an altar, but in the very moment you realize you can still remember. And the light will begin to pulse its first rhythm. In a world constantly moving, where everything is measured by productivity, speed, and results, the human soul is swept into an invisible spiral, gradually worn down, unable to name what has been lost. The calendar on your wall is packed with work. The calendar in your phone is filled with appointments, but the calendar in your heart, the calendar of the covenant, of sacred seasons, how long has it been since you opened it? You can continue living by the world's rhythm, rushing through each day, trading stillness for noise, choosing convenience over the sacred. But there is another choice, quieter, harder, deeper. To live by heaven's rhythm, a rhythm that needs no validation, no temple, no clergy, no institutional approval. It is a rhythm etched into your soul, if only you dare to remember. Try something simple. Choose one day and call it holy rest, not out of fatigue, but out of faithfulness. Re-examine your life and ask, what I eat, what I hold, what I do, does it preserve purity in my heart? Try living in season, in time, not out of ritual, but to align with something greater than yourself. You will not be perfect, but you will begin again, just as Noah once did. Amen.